Good morning, everyone. I'm the Reverend William Levwood. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the minister here at Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. Thank you for being here this morning. So as we begin our service this morning, I invite you to silence your phone if you're here in person, to close your windows on your computer, your other windows if you're at home, and most importantly, to take a deep breath and center yourself for worship. We open in welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land, who lived on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomeck Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing so that all together may one day know full justice. So the chalice is the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist movement. This is the church of the open mind. This is the church of the loving heart. This is the church of the helping hands. This is the church of the courageous spirit.
Good morning. I'm Paulette Lickman-Panzer, and I do hope that you all were as impressed with Rev Lev as I was before, because he didn't have the hymnal, and he could sing the words of that song. And I was really impressed because I had the words in front of me and I was having trouble. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. If you're new to Accotink, we'd like to talk more about, and you would like to talk more about this church. We always want to talk more about this church. But anybody here can help you. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour online and in person immediately after this service. We're glad that you came this morning.
So this service, we're going to explore just one teaching from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day Sunday. We're going to look at a speech, some words from a speech he gave in 1963 in my sermon. We'll actually have a few more words from him in a moment in our Time for All Ages. But we're also going to talk about Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister who published an essay in 1854 on justice and our conscience. And it's from that essay that Martin Luther King Jr. got the phrase of bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice. That he was paraphrasing Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist and a transcendentalist. Sometimes we forget that the transcendentalist was not just a theological and a literary movement, but was also thoroughly committed to social justice.
So glad to be here again. In our religious education, we're going to focus on Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy to us. On the next slide, you will see some signs from history, from the past. One sign says colored, one says white. Where would you find these signs? They hung over water fountains in Birmingham, Alabama. They were posted above restroom doors in Baltimore, Maryland. They were everywhere racial discrimination was present. These signs meant that people of color could not use the same water fountains, restrooms, and other places as white people. It was meant to keep people of color out of places where white people didn't want them. These signs represent a very sad time. So this month, our theme is Finding Our Center. This weekend, we celebrate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. So today, we center racial justice to find our center as a whole, multiracial people. Dr. King worked very hard to improve racial justice. After protest marches and new laws in the South, many of these kinds of signs were removed. But there are still many things that are a deep part of the racial injustice in our country. So we're all familiar with the I Have a Dream speech, so I'm just going to say this quote. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
So those words in that I Have a Dream speech are from the 28th of August, 1963, from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But that fierce urgency of now still applies today. Some ways it applies today more than it has over the past few decades, as we see the weakening of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, particularly the checks and balances on states using race-based voter suppression. Some of those checks and balances were taken away in 2013 by a ruling by the Supreme Court. And then since that time, we've seen an uptick in all kinds of voter suppression, often in, in deceptive ways, voter ID bills, shortening the amount of early voting time, moving polling sites or lowering polling sites. And in all of these cases, these seemingly neutral policies are actually targeting black and brown voters. Okay? So not to mention gerrymandering as well, and all these ways and not to mention all the other ways that racial justice is still baked into the structures of our society. So we still have this fierce urgency of now. And not only in racial justice, but as we look at this next slide, we also have an uptick, a resurgence in the vitriol and in legislation to try to take away hard-earned LGBTQ rights, particularly trans rights. When I saw the white and the colored sign, I was reminded of the bathroom bill when I lived in North Carolina a few years ago that had been put in place to restrict trans people's right to use the bathroom of the gender that they identify with. As well as in the last year and a half, there have been a number of legislation in Florida, where I also used to live, the Don't Say Gay bill. It's called the Don't Say Gay bill by its critics, that restricts the languaging in schools around gender and homosexuality, gay and lesbian issues. So imagine if you're a child with two moms or two dads, or a transgender child, and now you can't be open in Florida about that in your school setting because of this new law. So there is still this fierce urgency of now for racial justice, for LGBTQ justice, for voting rights and our democracy. There's a lot of work still to do. Next slide, please.
So this is another quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So in our religious education today, we're going to make some promised land signs. We're going to focus on signs that give us a just vision of the future.
We have two short readings this morning. The first is from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from his speech, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, given as the commencement speech at Oberlin College in 1964. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless effort and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. We shall overcome, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
And this is an excerpt from something called Living for Change, and it's by Grace Lee Boggs. And it focuses on what we need to do. Encourage groups of all kinds and all ages to participate in creating a vision of the future that will enlarge the humanity of all of us, and then devise concrete programs on which they can work together, if only in a small way, to move toward their vision in this unique interim time between historical epochs. This is how we can elicit the hope that it is essential to the building of a movement and unleash the energies that in the absence of hope are turned against other people or even against oneself. When people come together voluntarily to create their own vision, they begin wishing it to come into being, and with such passion that they begin creating an active path leading to it from the present. The Spirit, and the way to make the Spirit live and coalesce. Instead of seeing ourselves only as victims, we begin to see ourselves as part of a continuing struggle of human beings, not only to survive, but to evolve into more human beings.
I was struck as I listened to that reading from Grace Lee Boggs, who's a social justice activist. For many years, an elder in the social justice activist community in Detroit, Michigan. I was struck by hearing the 5 smooth stones that we talked about last week in that reading, the possibility that a new vision brings, the partnership of coming together to organize, to make justice and use our power that we have to do that, and the necessity of hope as well. So we're going to talk this morning about bending the arc, and that phrase, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, taken by itself, we can think that it's saying that it's inevitable. But in the context of Dr. King's speech, that's definitely not what's being said. In fact, this is what he says, some more of what he says in that speech. He says, "Let nobody give you the impression that the problem of racial injustice will work itself out. Let nobody give you the impression that only time will solve the problem. That is a myth. It is a myth because time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the people of ill will in our nation, the forces committed to negative ends, have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill." It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation not merely for the vitriolic works and violent actions of bad people who bomb a church in Birmingham, Alabama, or shoot down a civil rights worker in Selma, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, "Wait on time." somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of dedicated individuals. So we must help time and realize that the time is always right to do the right thing. Now, Theodore Parker, in 1852, in his essay, when he was talking about this arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, he precedes that statement talking about how unjust societies inevitably fall. So I think Parker, like the Quran, there's a lot of verses in the Quran that likewise list unjust empires of the past and then their demise, and then name another unjust empire from the past and its demise. And Parker does that too, naming more recent to his time period unjust societies. And he adds in the people who rose up to help bring those unjust societies to more justice. And the other thing that Dr. King does, the other context that he gives, is he says that he can sing the song, "We Shall Overcome," because abused and scorned though we have been, talking about black people in America, abused and scorned though we have been, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. He says, before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Thomas Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. And for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton, they built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most oppressive conditions. They continued to grow and develop. In the midst of the most oppressive conditions, they continued to grow and develop. Certainly, if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Yes, we shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So you see clearly in that speech the line of struggle and work passed down from generation to generation, continuing on into the future that bends the arc of justice. The arc of the universe towards justice. Parker has a few things to say about justice, so I want to share some of his wisdom about what is justice. What are we bending the arc of the universe towards? And I think it's instructive that Theodore Parker nearly makes justice, or the idea of justice, synonymous with God. So let's just sit with that for a moment. So if the force for justice, the idea of justice, is God or is the work of God, the primary, central, perhaps the only work of God, it makes me think of 2 things. One, I'm an atheist to some visions of God, but I could be a theist if God is justice, right? If God is the force for justice, I'm down with that, right? Yeah? Right. So the other thing that Parker says is, and this goes back to that power that James Luther Adam talks about, that we have the power to make good things happen. So he says that this justice is not just some transcendent idea outside of us, but it lives within us through our conscience. And he differentiates, he says that if we look at history, Certainly we can see examples of justice and injustice, but we don't find the vision of justice in history. We haven't gotten fully to that ideal yet. That eternal justice, which perhaps is why he associates it with a transcendent God, that eternal justice is something we have to imagine with our intuition, with our conscience, and he says we know it. We know it. I think of all the rationalizations that our minds can make to rationalize injustice, but we know. Do you agree? Do you hear me? We know in our hearts, in our conscience, what is and isn't just. So while there's this eternal experience of justice, and it lives in each person, I want to share one more thing about it. Parker compares it to the law of attraction in the sensory, in the material world. Right? He's talking about gravity. He's talking about how water coheres, how atoms cohere together. He says that is observable as the force that's central in nature, in the sensory world. And he compares justice in our moral life to that attraction, that gravity, that cohesion in the sensory world. But he also uses the temperance of the body. Okay, so I'm going to quote him here because it's just beautiful how he says this. He says, temperance is corporeal justice, the doing right to each limb of the body, and is the mean proportional between appetite and appetite, or one and all, sacrificing no majority to one desire, however great, no minority, however little, to a majority, but giving each its due, and all the harmonious and well-proportioned symmetry that is for all. It keeps the proportions, holds an even balance within the body so that there shall be no excess. Now let's break that down a little bit, right? We need our lungs as much as we need our heart, as much as we need our feet and our muscles and our skin. Right? We need all of it in proper proportion. We can't say that one is better than the other, superior to the other. We need it all. So likewise with justice in human affairs, this is a step even beyond democracy. If democracy is the majority making the decisions, because in the realm of justice, we even care for the minority, because that's a part of our collective body as well. Not to mention, side note, that we are not right now ruled by a majority. We're ruled by a minority because of how our democracy, if we can call it that, is set up. But even if we got to rule by majority, there's another step, right? That's just part of the way there. Even there's another step to get to justice, which is that harmony of the whole. And then even another step is to bring in the natural world. So I've been thinking about the image of the ark. And if we're bending the ark, then what shape is the ark taking before we bend it, right? It's going, I imagine it going up, right? And we have to bend it towards the horizontal. So I think this is important. Parker also talks about how the powerful hold on to power and create structures in society to keep power in the hands of a few rather than in the hands of many. And this is also based in a belief in a hierarchy, right? Survival of the fittest, images of domination, that one race is naturally superior and should be dominant over another, that men are naturally dominant and superior and should be dominant over women, that human beings are superior and should be dominant over animals and plants and nature, right? So we have this hierarchical view, and this is important because a lot of conservatism, going back to the image of justice, a lot of conservatism says, well, if we look at societies and men have power Well, then that must be the natural order of things. If we look at societies and we don't see LGBTQ people thriving and having power, then that must be the natural order of things. But remember, Parker and King both say that justice is not what we see in history, but is an eternal vision and idea and force that we bring into being. So we need to bend this idea of hierarchy and the ways that it has been structured into our society, in our schools, in our economics, in our how we lay out our neighborhoods. We could go on and on. We need to bend it towards justice. So if you will, let's imagine justice. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to talk about, so we have this hierarchy. Well, let me just say, I think that as we move towards justice, that's the horizontal axis, okay? The relationship between people and the balance between people. But I want to say that Ibram X. Kendi, in his book, which is a history of racist ideas, stamped from the beginning, I have it right here. It's kind of a big book. He says, he makes an important point about how racist ideas come from the people in power's desire to stay in power. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. I want to recommend this version of this book. See, it's a lot shorter. This is stamped. This is the remix of Stamped from the Beginning. It's Jason Reynolds, who's our National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, and he rewrote the book. Ibram X. Kendi said, don't just make an adaptation, really rewrite the book. And I have to say, it's actually fun to read this book. It's actually fun to read this book that's about the history of racist ideas, and which includes racist actions in America. And, by the way, this is our banned book club's next selection. So you have a month, almost a month, right? We met on Tuesday for the banned book club for this month. So you have almost a month to get this book and read it. I highly recommend that you do it. So here's a quote. This is from the introduction to the book, so not Jason Reynolds' voice, but Ibram X. Kendi's voice. By the way, there's a stamp for kids that came out more recently. I would recommend skipping both of these, even though this one's even smaller, and just sticking with this one. It's just so well written and amazing. Even with your kids, I think you could use the middle one, the Jason Reynolds one. So Ibram X. Kendi says this, going back to the origin of racist ideas that create racist structures. He says, when I was in school and first really learning about racism, I was taught the popular origin story. I was taught that ignorant and hateful people had produced racist ideas and that these racist people had instituted racist policies. But when I learned the motive behind the production of racist ideas, it became obvious this folktale was not true. I found that the need, pay attention here, I found that the need of powerful people to defend racist policies that benefited them led them to produce racist ideas. And when unsuspecting people around them consumed these racist ideas, they became ignorant and hateful. Think of it this way, he continues. There are only two potential explanations for racial inequality, for why white people were free and black people were enslaved in the United States. Either racist policies forced black people into enslavement, or animalistic black people were fit for slavery. Now, if you make a lot of money enslaving people, then to defend your business, you want people to believe that black people are fit for slavery. You will produce and circulate this racist idea to stop abolitionists from challenging slavery, from abolishing what is making you rich. You see the racist policies of slavery arrive first, and then the racist policies follow to justify slavery. And then these racist ideas make people ignorant about racism and hateful of other racial groups. Yeah? Ibn Rex Kendi made an important point on this point when he was the lecturer for our Where lecture at our UUA General Assembly this past summer. He was asked about the question, he says, don't waste your time trying to change racist people's ideas, change policies. But he made a clarifying point when our UUA president, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, asked him about this. He said, the everyday person who has consumed racist ideas and fallen for them, and ourselves, in as much as we have consumed and fallen for those ideas, we can be changed. And we should work to change each other and people like that. But then there are the people who know it's a lie in the first place, who are using it to work the levers of power to get rich and to stay powerful. And Ibn Rex Kendi is saying, don't waste your time trying to change their mind, okay? They know what's up. So I just want to clarify that point. So back to the arc and the hierarchy. So if we have this idea of hierarchy, and we're bending it towards a more horizontal way of being in the world, I'm going to go back to MLK. And this is what he says. He says, anyone who feels that we can live in isolation today, anyone who feels that we can live without being concerned about other individuals and other nations is sleeping through a revolution. The world in which we live is geographically one. He suggested maybe there was a time when we were more isolated and you could have justice over here and injustice over here and they could coexist, but now we're so global that we're inextricably interwoven together and interdependent. So now the great challenge is to make this geographical unity and interdependence into a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a family, a kinship. And then he goes on, and it's interesting, Parker does this too. They both talk about technology and the focus on technological progress and a lack of focus on moral progress, on a focus on just relations between people. So we can send people to the moon. We can do a better job of feeding people because of industrial agriculture, even though that has pros and cons as well when we think about climate. But some of the hopeful things I shared last week around the world about the lowering of hunger, the more access to clean water, lower infant mortality rates, lower maternal rates. Some of this comes in part through technological progress, but we still are learning how to live together justly. And both of these prophets, first in 1852 and then in 1964, are telling us that we need to put our attention towards our moral uplift and our moral formation so that we can bend the arc towards a more horizontal, a more equal way of being in the world. And the way to do that is what Grace Lee Boggs told us. The way to do that is for people of goodwill to put bodies and souls in motion. That's Theodore Parker. King says it this way: the challenge before us today is to develop, I love this, a coalition of conscience. To develop a coalition of conscience. I didn't write the end of the sermon. I'm trying to figure out how to sum up. Or I don't like what's on the paper. It's not doing it well enough. So we are caught in this inescapable web of mutuality. Those are King's words. And I think that's synonymous with how Parker's describing justice. This deep interdependence that means we can't live in gated communities. Even if all we care about is our own selfish well-being, The truth of the nature of reality is that it is structured to be so interdependent that we can't be fully, and this is, I'm paraphrasing King now, we can't be fully what we're meant to be if somebody else is not able to be fully what they're meant to be. Because we live and grow together. We are one body. So on this day, I guess the other thing I want to say is give us some hope. So if you look close up at the ark, I don't think it looks like an ark at all. I think it looks like this, right? And that's actually not a totally bad thing. I've said in the past that an oscillating narrative, where there's highs and lows, is a resilient narrative. A narrative that it's just getting better and better and better and better. That's a brittle, fragile, easily broken narrative because it's not how the world works. It's also equally fragile and brittle to say the world is getting worse and worse and worse. The world is oscillating. But if we take a step back, then we see the arc. In the long arc of history, we see how it is, has been, and can continue to be bent by us towards justice. So let's feel hopeful and continue to do that work of justice that lives inside us, that we know how to do, and join together. Like Grace Lee Boggs. Can we quote? Let's end with Grace Lee Boggs' quote. Encourage groups of all kinds and all ages to participate in creating a vision of the future that will enlarge the humanity of all of us, and then devise concrete programs on which we can all work together. May it be so, and may we be among those who make it so. Amen, 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 and blessed be.
Though we will extinguish our chalice flame, we carry within us what we kindled, the light of inspiration, the warmth of compassion, the fire of commitment. May we bring these gifts into our lives and share them radiantly out in the world. Well, I guess you have to stand up again. Sorry about that. I mean, it's good exercise. It's all good up and down. I invite you to join me now in our community blessing with the words of David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together, in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity.
So for our closing words, I just want to say, may we be worthy of our inheritance, of the sacrifice that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made, of all who have dedicated their lives to the work of justice. May we be worthy of that inheritance, and may we live our lives inspired by their example as we work for justice.